The shrill sound of the alarm shattered the silence in the small apartment. Emily Saunders, still groggy with sleep, groped around her nightstand until she found her phone. It was 6 in the morning, and the rain was beating against the window with the same persistence the day would demand of her. Between shifts at the cafe, hours at the animal shelter, and nighttime study sessions, rest was an abstract concept. But she liked to think that her determination made every minute spent chasing a seemingly distant dream worthwhile. With a lukewarm cup of coffee in hand, she glanced quickly at her phone messages. Among the irrelevant notifications was one from Thomas. "Dinner tonight? We need to talk." It was unusual. Elaborate dinners weren't their thing. Her hectic life didn't allow for such luxuries, and Thomas, with his packed schedule at the law firm, had also seemed content with their occasional nights in, sharing pizza and unpressured silences. Despite the message's air of disguised gravity, she tried to push aside her unease. When they first met, Thomas had been an unlikely constant in her life. Sophisticated, methodical, but with a genuine kindness that seemed to bridge their differences. He came from an influential family. She was the daughter of a nurse who had worked double shifts to support her alone. What did they have in common? She still didn't know. That evening, Emily walked to the restaurant in West End, one of Thomas's favorites, with its modern chandeliers and polished waitstaff. He was already there, seated at a table in the back. When he saw her, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're early," Emily said, trying to sound lighthearted, but the tension in the room seemed to conspire against her. "I wanted a moment to think before we talked," he said, gesturing for the waiter and avoiding her gaze. The silence that followed was colder than the rain outside. Finally, Thomas took a deep breath and looked at her. "Emily, I wanted to be honest. We need to talk about what we are and what we're not." Emily leaned forward, trying to decipher what was coming. "Okay, what's going on?" Thomas hesitated, running a hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized as something he did before saying something difficult. "My family thinks our relationship..." He paused, as if carefully selecting his words. "They think it doesn't make sense for my future." The words hit her like a stone. Emily felt the chair beneath her, but suddenly it seemed like she was floating. "Your family?" Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "And you?" "I..." He stammered, finally mustering the courage to meet her gaze. "I think maybe they're right." Emily sat frozen, his words echoing in her mind like a broken bell. For a moment, the restaurant around them disappeared. "So that's it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Emily, I care about you, but I want to build a stable life, and maybe you need something I can't give you." She blinked slowly, feeling her face flush, but she managed to hold back tears. He had expected her to plead, to argue. But all she did was nod. "All right," she stood, grabbing her bag. "If that's how you feel, there's nothing more to discuss." Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but she was already walking away. The rain hit her the instant she stepped outside, but the chill from moments earlier felt far colder. Back at her apartment, Emily dropped her bag on the floor and collapsed onto the couch. Finally, the tears came. Not for Thomas, but for the bitter sting of being discarded. As if all the effort she put in, all her struggles, had been invisible. But between the tears, something began to emerge. A fierce conviction. "I don't need to prove myself to anyone," she murmured to herself. That night, as the rain persisted, Emily decided her journey would be different. She wasn't the kind of person who let others define her worth. If Thomas was the past, she had a future waiting to be claimed. The alarm would ring again in the morning, and she would be ready. The morning began like any other. The insistent alarm, the rushed coffee, and the persistent feeling that the day was always one step ahead of Emily. Yet, something was different. As she pulled open the door of the small wardrobe in the corner of her room, the unmistakable sound of old wood giving way filled the air. The shelf collapsed, spilling clothes onto the floor and exposing the fragility of the piece, which should have been replaced months ago. Emily stared at the chaos in front of her, sighing. Buying a new wardrobe wasn't an option. Between overdue bills and rising rent, fixing it seemed like the only solution. She grabbed her phone and typed "Local Carpenters Vancouver" into a service site. The list of options was long, but she chose Noah Whitaker. The name seemed ordinary, but the reviews were good. and he responded quickly. A few hours later, the sound of knocking pulled her away from an anatomy textbook. When she opened the door, a tall man in a thick coat and rain-soaked work boots stood there. He had an easy smile and a toolbox balanced in one hand. "Are you Emily?" he asked, his relaxed tone contrasting with the grayness of the day. "Yes, I am. Thanks for coming so quickly." She gestured for him to come in. Noah glanced around the small apartment before walking over to the wardrobe. He crouched to inspect the broken furniture, running his fingers along the worn edges. This poor thing has seen better days, but nothing a little patience and a few screws can't fix. Emily perched on the edge of the sofa, watching as he began to work. The rhythmic sound of tools filled the space, but eventually, Noah broke the silence. "So what do you do?" "I work at an animal shelter nearby and also at a cafe, plus I'm studying to get into veterinary school." He paused, looking up for a moment, clearly intrigued. "That sounds intense." "It is." She shrugged, forcing a smile. "But it's worth it. I want to make a difference." Noah returned to his work but kept the conversation going with an easy, casual tone, as if warming up to her. "And the shelter? Must be rewarding." Emily nodded, feeling more at ease now. "It is, but it's also hard. Sometimes it feels like we're never doing enough." Noah glanced at her with a subtle smile, one filled with something that looked like admiration. "You're doing more than most people would. That counts for a lot." She fell silent, surprised by the simplicity and sincerity of his words. It was rare to hear something so direct, without the layer of judgment or expectation that so many people seem to carry. When Noah finished, the wardrobe looked almost new. He tested the door, satisfied. "This'll hold up for a long time now. I added some reinforcements." Emily smiled for the first time in days, feeling a genuine sense of relief. "It looks great. Thank you." He pulled a card from the pocket of his jacket and placed it on the table. "If you need help with anything else, just call." After he left, she looked at the card, her fingers tracing the simple letters. Noah Whitaker, Carpentry and Repairs. It wasn't just the wardrobe that seemed fixed. There was something about the brief interaction that left Emily feeling lighter. In the following days, Noah returned to the apartment with practical excuses, a forgotten tool, and a suggestion for improving the wardrobe's support. He always brought something useful, but he also seemed to find time to ask about the shelter or her studies. And little by little, the weight of the world Emily carried began to feel a little less heavy. The days passed in a frantic rhythm. Between cafe shifts, mornings at the shelter, and endless hours of studying, Emily felt like she was running on a treadmill that never stopped. She knew the veterinary school admission test was her chance to change everything, but exhaustion was beginning to seep into every corner of her energy. One afternoon, as she reviewed notes at one of the shelter's tables, Noah appeared in the doorway, effortlessly carrying a bag of cat food. "Thought you might need this," he said, lifting the bag with a smile. "Always do. Thanks." Emily tried to smile, but the fatigue weighed heavily in her voice. He watched her for a moment, his expression serious. "You're burning yourself out, aren't you?" "It's nothing I can't handle," she said, trying to deflect, her eyes returning to the open notebook in front of her. Noah pulled out a chair and sat across from her. He didn't speak for a while, the muffled sounds of barking dogs filling the silence. "Listen, Emily, I know you can do all this on your own, but just because you can, doesn't mean you have to." She looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe you should take a break from the cafe job. Focus on studying." Emily frowned. "That would be great, but do you think the bills will just disappear?" He smirked, pulling a piece of paper from his jacket pocket and miming a figure in an imaginary budget. "What if I helped? Not forever, just until the test." The suggestion caught her so off guard that she laughed, as if he were joking. "You want to pay my bills?" "I do." He spoke calmly, without hesitation. "Because I believe you can ace this test, and because I know in the future you're going to be helping more lives than I can count." She shook her head, her eyes fixed on the table. "Noah, I can't accept that. I don't want to depend on anyone." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his voice low and firm. "Depending on someone isn't weakness, Emily. It's knowing when to accept help. Sometimes being strong means letting someone share the weight." She stayed silent for a long moment, the sounds of dogs and the rustling leaves outside mingling with the storm of thoughts in her mind. What he said made sense, but accepting felt like breaking a principle she'd held onto her entire life. Finally, she let out a sigh. If I accept, it's only until the test. After that, I go back to handling it myself. Noah gave her an easy smile, as if he had already known her answer. Deal. In the weeks that followed, Emily spent more time focused on her studies than she ever had before. Without the endless cafe shifts, her mind felt clearer, better able to absorb what she read. Noah showed up frequently, bringing food for the shelter animals or simply checking in to make sure she was doing okay. One afternoon, he arrived with something different. A handmade study desk. Thought you needed something better than that old desk, he said, carefully placing the piece in the corner of Emily's apartment. She was speechless, running her fingers over the smooth wooden edges. You made this for me? Of course. He shrugged, trying to seem casual. It's no big deal. But it was a big deal. Not just because of how beautiful the desk was, but because of what the gesture meant. For the first time in a long time, Emily realized she wasn't facing everything alone. As the test approached, she began to feel more confident, as though each page she read at the new desk was a step in the right direction. And every time Noah stopped by, with a bag of supplies or words of encouragement, she realized he wasn't just helping. He believed in her in a way she had never experienced before. The night before the test, he found her at the shelter, organizing cages and cleaning hurriedly, trying to distract herself from her nerves. It's going to be fine, Emily, he said, leaning against the doorway, his hands in his pockets. I hope you're right. She smiled faintly, drying her hands on a cloth. It's not about hope. I know. She didn't respond, but as Noah left, his words lingered. For the first time, she found herself starting to believe them too. The white envelope arrived one morning without warning, buried among bills and flyers. Emily opened it casually as she sipped her coffee, unaware it contained an invitation to revisit a chapter she had worked hard to leave behind. You are invited to the wedding of Thomas Bennett and Clara Hastings. She let out a dry laugh before snapping the invitation shut. Thomas's wedding. Her ex-boyfriend. Now engaged to someone perfectly aligned with the world of appearances he so valued. Everything in her urged her to ignore the invitation, but something stirred beneath the surface. It wasn't curiosity. It was a need to prove that the past no longer had power over her. When she told Noah, his eyebrows shot up in surprise. You want to go? He asked, adjusting his cap as he sanded a piece of wood at the shelter. It's not about him. It's about me, she replied firmly. I need to see it with my own eyes and know it doesn't matter to me anymore. Noah stayed quiet for a moment, studying her carefully. All right, but if he tries anything, I promise I won't let it slide. Emily laughed, shaking her head. You don't need to play the hero. I think I've already worked it out with him. On the afternoon of the wedding, the weather was crisp and clear, the blue sky reflecting off the mountains surrounding Whistler. Emily wore a simple but elegant dress, while Noah, in a suit that seemed tailored to him, radiated an effortless charm that turned heads without trying. As they stepped into the grand hall, illuminated by towering chandeliers, the hum of conversation paused for a moment. Emily noticed the stares. They weren't disdainful but surprised. No one had expected her to be there. Least of all like this, radiating confidence with every step. Thomas was the first to approach. Dressed in an impeccable tuxedo, he looked ready to face the world, but his eyes betrayed his shock at seeing Emily. Emily, he said, his voice tinged with something between nervousness and admiration. You came. Looks like I did. She smiled politely, maintaining an emotional distance that left him uneasy. You look incredible. He hesitated, his eyes scanning the room before returning to hers. And, how's life? Better than ever. Her response was straightforward, leaving no room for further questions. Noah appeared beside her, extending a hand to Thomas with a calm that was almost unsettling. Noah, nice to meet you. Thomas shook his hand, but his expression was transparent. He didn't know how to handle this meeting. Before the conversation could deepen, Clara, the bride, appeared. Tall, flawless, with a look as sharp as the diamonds in her earrings. She shot a quick glance at Emily before addressing Thomas, her voice edged with irritation. Danny, don't you think you've given them enough attention? Emily noticed the tension but stayed silent. Clara turned to her, narrowing her eyes. "So you're the famous Emily, the woman he could never get over." The declaration froze the room. Thomas tried to calm her, but Clara, now furious, pressed on. "If she's so perfect, why didn't you marry her? Or do you still want to?" The silence that followed was crushing. Before anyone could respond, a shout came from across the room. "Someone, help." All heads turned. Thomas's father had collapsed, clutching his chest, his skin pale and sweaty. Emily moved instinctively, kneeling beside him. "He's having a heart attack," she said, her voice steady but calm. She began chest compressions while another guest called for an ambulance. Noah, wasting no time, helped clear the growing crowd, giving Emily space to work. Time seemed to stretch, but eventually the man began to breathe more steadily. When the paramedics arrived, Emily handed over control of the situation, exhausted but relieved. Renata Bennett, Thomas's mother, approached her with tears in her eyes. "Thank you. You saved his life." Emily nodded, retreating to a corner as Noah joined her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Thomas tried to speak with her later, but Emily stopped him before he could begin. "There's no need to thank me, Thomas. This isn't about us." He looked at her, frustrated, but she gave him no chance to argue. "You're part of a chapter that's already closed. What I have now is something you could never have given me, someone who believed in me, even when everything seemed lost." She turned away, taking Noah's hand, who had been waiting patiently. Together, they left the hall, leaving the past firmly behind them. In that moment, Emily felt the weight of a door closing. Whatever lay on the other side no longer mattered. She had something better, a future she could truly call her own. The days after the wedding felt different. There was a lightness in the way Emily faced the world, as if she had let go of a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying. She was weeks away from the veterinary school admission test, and though the demands were high, her confidence had never been stronger. But with progress came new challenges. Not just external ones, but internal ones, the kind that settle in silences and exchanged glances. Emily and Noah found themselves meeting nearly every evening, either at the shelter or in her small apartment. He continued bringing useful gifts, bags of pet food, tools, or even homemade meals he insisted were no big deal. She studied while he sanded wood or adjusted carpentry projects. Their partnership was natural and quiet, but there was something unspoken lingering in the air. One night, as Emily reviewed notes at the desk Noah had built for her, he walked into the apartment with a different expression. His eyes seemed restless, and she could tell he was carrying something heavier than the toolbox in his hand. "Is everything okay?" she asked, closing her notebook and turning to him. He hesitated, setting the toolbox down and rubbing the back of his neck. "Do you ever wonder if everything we're doing is really going to work out?" Emily frowned, confused. "You mean the test?" "No." He shook his head. "I mean us." Her stomach tightened. It was the first time he had put it into words. "Why are you asking that?" "Because sometimes I think." He stopped, choosing his words carefully. "I see you moving forward so fast, achieving so much, and I can't help but wonder, am I enough?" Emily stared at him, surprised. She had never imagined he felt this way. Noah always seemed so solid, so self-assured. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice soft. "I am." He sighed, sitting down in the chair across from her. "I'm a carpenter, Emily. My job is to fix things, make furniture. It's simple, you know? But you're heading into a world where people save lives, change the world." She crossed her arms, feeling a mix of frustration and tenderness. "Do you think I care about that?" "It's not that," he quickly replied. I don't want to be a burden to you." Emily was silent for a moment before standing and walking over to him. She knelt beside him, taking his hands and forcing him to look at her. "Noah, you're not a burden. You've never been. You're the only reason I'm still standing. Do you think this desk is just a desk? It's not. It's a symbol of everything you've done for me, even when I was about to fall apart." He looked away, clearly emotional, but she didn't let him escape. "You gave me strength when I had none. That's more than enough." They sat in silence, the weight of her words filling the space. Finally, he nodded, squeezing her hands tighter. "I just needed to hear that." From that moment on, something shifted between them. The fear that had crept in was replaced by a deeper understanding. a quiet commitment to face the future together, no matter the uncertainties. As Emily prepared for the test, Noah threw himself into new projects in his workshop, expanding his small carpentry business to meet the growing demand from the community. He began training young apprentices, teaching them woodworking and repair skills. His work was not just functional, it was meaningful, touching lives in ways he had never imagined. When the day of the test finally arrived, Noah was there, holding her hand before she walked into the university building. "You're gonna crush it," he said with the confident smile she had grown to love. "I wouldn't have made it this far without you." He shook his head. "No, you've always been here. I just reminded you of that." The hours inside the exam room were grueling, but when Emily walked out, the first thing she saw was Noah's face. He was leaning against his truck, holding 2 coffees. "Well?" he asked, handing her one of the cups. "It was hard." She laughed, taking the coffee. "But I think I did it." I never doubted it. In the days that followed, as they waited for the results, they both threw themselves into their work. Emily returned to the shelter with renewed energy, while Noah started building custom shelves and benches for the space. When the envelope with the results finally arrived, Emily opened it with trembling hands, sitting at the same desk Noah had built. He was beside her, watching silently. "I passed," she whispered, her voice incredulous. Noah laughed, pulling her into a hug so strong it almost made her drop the letter. "I knew it," he said, spinning her around. In that moment, everything felt possible. Together, they weren't just building a future, they were building a home. A life that was entirely theirs, piece by piece. The spring sun filtered through the windows of the chalet in Deep Cove, casting soft shadows across Emily's study desk. She was organizing papers, preparing for her first day as a veterinary student at the University of British Columbia. It was a new chapter, but a familiar weight still lingered. University would be a mountain to climb, and she knew the challenges would be constant. Meanwhile, in the backyard, Noah was adjusting the hinges on a wooden bench he was building for a neighbor. His workshop grew busier by the day, transforming into a community space where he trained young apprentices in carpentry and offered free repairs to locals in need. His work wasn't just functional, it was a declaration of purpose. When Emily stepped outside, Noah noticed her thoughtful expression. "Nervous?" he asked without looking up from the bench. "I don't know if nervous is the word. Maybe overwhelmed." He smiled and set the tool aside. "Nothing new, right? You always handle it." She laughed but didn't reply. They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the hammer and the distant chirping of birds filling the space. Then, Emily took a deep breath. "Noah, there's something I need to tell you." He immediately looked up, his brow furrowed with concern. "What is it?" She hesitated, the words feeling too big for her mouth. "I think I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was deep but not uncomfortable. Noah looked at her, his eyes gradually lighting up, and then he broke into a smile that seemed to fill the entire world. "Really?" Emily nodded, biting her lip. "I took a test yesterday, but I still want to confirm with the doctor." Before she could say more, Noah was already at her side, holding her by the waist and spinning her in the air. "This is incredible," he laughed, his joy overflowing. "We're having a baby." Emily's laughter echoed as she clung to his shoulders, relieved by his warm reaction. "We don't know for sure yet, Noah. Let's not jump ahead." Right. He set her down, but his smile didn't fade. "But either way, this changes everything, doesn't it?" And it did. In the months that followed, Emily and Noah began preparing the small chalet for their baby's arrival. Noah transformed a spare room into a charming nursery, each piece of furniture hand-carved with delicate details that reflected his love for both Emily and the new life they were creating. Emily continued balancing her studies and work at the shelter, but with a renewed energy. The thought of building a life not just for herself, but for a new family, gave her an even greater sense of purpose. Finally, on a calm summer afternoon, Emily gave birth to a healthy baby girl they named Lily. When Noah held his daughter for the first time, his eyes brimmed with tears and his voice trembled. "She's perfect, just like you." Exhausted, Emily smiled up at him. "She's ours, Noah. She's everything we dreamed of." The chalet became the center of a life filled with meaning. Emily advanced in her studies, dedicating herself to animal health projects that connected rural communities to veterinary care. Noah expanded his workshop, employing young people and creating an environment of learning and opportunity. One evening, as they rested in the backyard, watching Lily play on the swing Noah had built, Emily broke the silence. "Have you ever stopped to think about how all this started?" Noah looked at her with a smile. "With a broken wardrobe. And look where we are now." She laughed, shaking her head. "Sometimes I think it was luck." He pulled her closer. "But most of the time, I think it was you." Emily looked at him, surprised. "Me? You? With your stubbornness and your courage to keep going, even when everything was falling apart. You're the heart of all this, Emily." She kissed him, no words needed. Under the stars in Deep Cove, they knew they had built more than a life together. They had created a story of resilience, love, and purpose that, like Noah's furniture, was made to last.
If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. We need your support.
Better stories are yet to come.